So there are some actions that are individual, like I create a company. When I create a company, I decide the rules of my company. I decide the rules of my farm, some of my family, but that's mostly my wife, but I still can decide something. And when I decide that, that's centralization. It's not bad. It's central planning in a way, and it's good because it's efficient. It allows me to design things for the future, so it's a good kind of centralization. But when you have to design stuff for many, many, many different people that may have different values, different priorities, different cultures, they may live in different times and different places, then central design doesn't work anymore, especially if you have to enforce it with violence like government does. So when you have a protocol which is not enforced with violence, it's just enforced economically because everybody wants to agree to the same protocol, you have this phenomenon in which basically some rules emerge from a lot of individual attempts, and these rules are very, very difficult to change, and that's good. Like if you create your game with your 3 friends, you are able to change the rules every time you want. You are very flexible, you can adjust, you are efficient because you can do whatever you want. But if you want a game that can be played across centuries and across nations, then you need an established, stable, immutable set of rules. If you want to modify the rules of the game of chess, I mean, how do you do that? It's global, it exists since millenniums, so it's well, centuries at least. You cannot, no single agent can propose a modification to that. You can propose your version, like fog war chess, which is different, but it's just your version. The mainstream chess thing will still continue. The immutability just means that there are so many people and they are so different that the chance for you to propose a change and get it accepted is basically zero, or is very, very low. So immutability is not like a violent thing. It's just the power of time and people. So the longest some set of rules is used, the longer a convention is used, and the larger amount of people use the same convention, the harder it would be for any individual to change it, which is good because it provides, even without violence, it provides an incentive to converge over the same thing, which goes for languages. Like we think the languages must be enforced by a government because that's what's happened in the last, let's say, after the 19th century. But languages develop mostly naturally without any kind of, well, with few examples of violence. People will just have to speak with each other, and so they will select. We're speaking in English, not because I'm very good at English, but because that's just a consensus. English is not the language I would have chosen because, like, phonetics is crazy. If you think how you write stuff in English and how you read, it comes from English history of absorbing words from every other language, so it's crazy. That's crazy phonetics, but it's the standard, so I use it. And in a way, this is the same for maybe you have a great idea for the internet, which is better, but you will use TCP/IP because it's a standard, and you cannot change it. You can propose something better, but the only way you can change it, there are 2 moments in which you can individually rebuild everything. One, when the current standard collapses for some reason, and that's what basically Satoshi did. When the fiat money in 2008 was seen as possibly collapsing in the future, it still hasn't, but it's still going to do, and then you can recreate an alternative. And when your idea for the alternative is, they say, 10 times better or 100 times better. So there is the concept of local optimum or global optimum. So let's say that you are a marble and you have to go down because you follow gravity. So if there is like a very small minimum here, you will just go there and you will remain there. You will not go elsewhere because this is the local optimization of your falling, which is what you want to do if you are a marble. But maybe if you just go over this hill, there is this other huge, there's this huge valley. So spontaneous processes, most often they get locked into this local optimum. And sometimes you need a revolution, because even if the spontaneous process brought you to a standard that was good enough here, then you need a push to go over to go away from the standard and find a better standard, which is what Bitcoin is. Like, fiat money was basically a Schelling point in a way for the world, but it was a bad one, unstable, producing a lot of bad stuff. So Satoshi had to refuse the standard. The real standard for money right now is the US dollar. That's the standard. So by my same principle, I would have to say I accept English, I accept the dollar. But English, even if its phonetic is crazy, it's fine. It does work. I can use it. We are using it, and it doesn't provide any. It doesn't create injustice. I mean, yeah, it creates an advantage for people that are born in English-speaking countries. There is an unfair advantage, but who cares? I can just learn English. Fiat money, and US dollar specifically, it's broken. It's something creating a lot of injustice and a lot of stealing with inflation, a lot of censorship, a lot of centralization and violence. So Satoshi had to break the standard, which is the US dollar, to find another standard which is more than 100 times better. If you really want to change the rules of Bitcoin, the process is very, very long, and it may not even be possible anymore. We don't know if it's still possible. We know that we did it with Taproot the last time. We know that we may want to do it again with any Prevout or CTV or cross-input signature aggregation, but we don't know if that will happen, because in order to change the protocol, literally every important economic user must agree. And service providers, they have to follow users to provide their services. They also have to agree in a way. It's less important because service providers will agree eventually, because if there is demand, supply will arrive in a market usually. It's very hard that users want a node that is developed in that way and no developer in the world want to develop it. If you pay, some developers will develop it. They are not commodity, but eventually they will become. And if you pay miners, miners will mine it because they want money. So they have cost, they spend electricity, they want money in exchange. So what you have to do is to convince users, basically. But that may not be possible because you don't have to convince a subset of users. You basically have to convince all of them, which is something that, like, if we want to change the rules of, I don't know, HTML5, it's a very recent standard. There is a centralized entity that basically call the shots, so it's possible. If you want to modify IP protocol, as I said, you basically can't. It's the same thing. If you want to change Bitcoin, you really need to prove that your change makes sense, and that's harder and harder and harder. Every year will be harder to change Bitcoin. That just concerns the base layer, the consensus layer. Everything on top, including how a Lightning channel works, how routing works, how custodians can use or not use Lightning, how your wallet will look, that can change completely, which is also very important. People tend to overestimate the importance of consensus rules, but many innovation in Bitcoins are not coming through consensus changes. For example, before you have to back up individual private keys in a file that was very hard to back up and to keep in sync. Then you had deterministic hierarchic wallets, bit 32, so you had the seed phrase with bit 39. This was a huge change for Bitcoin usability, but it didn't imply any consensus change. Or again, addresses. Before you have, when Satoshi started, you had to insert the IP of the person you wanted to call, then you called the IP, and the computer provided you with a public key. But then Satoshi introduced the pay to public key hash, and then we introduced the pay to script hash, so we could do more complex smart contract. Now Taproot, which is even more complex. Now Taproot required a consensus change, but most of the change will be like the QR code or the unified QR code, LNURL, or offers, Bolt 12, all this stuff. They are not touching Bitcoin consensus, but they're as important, if not more important at this stage, than the consensus itself. Bitcoin will change dramatically, even if Bitcoin rules at the time chain level will not change anymore. So very often Bitcoin is discussed as having a governance process that may involve several actors. For example, the typical division is between nodes and miners. Sometimes developers are also mentioned, but then there is also the concept of users, like user-activated soft fork. This division is very confusing. I think it's not perfectly orthogonal. It's not well presented because it creates a lot of confusion. First of all, there is one element in Bitcoin that is never mentioned in governance discussions, which is status quo. The most powerful actor in Bitcoin is not miners, it's not users, it's not nodes, it's just the status quo. What Bitcoin is the strongest element, is the strongest actor in the governance of what Bitcoin will be. So it's not like if there is just a majority of people among miners or nodes that want to change, then they will change. There will be a resistance, an inertial force from Bitcoin as is to resist. Eventually, some layers of Bitcoin, not all, but some basic layers, like the layer 1, the time chain consensus, may even ossify. When we say ossification, we mean that we may arrive to a level where the basic consensus will not change anymore at all. Like internet, the base layer of the internet, IP, doesn't change anymore since 1984. Version 4, and it doesn't change it anymore. Everything on top evolves, changes a lot, but the base layer is basically ossified. Maybe it will change in centuries or decades. There is a IP version 6, which is starting to get around. With Bitcoin, something similar could happen. So the first element of Bitcoin is basically the status quo, Bitcoin itself, the self-perpetuating consensus, the network itself. Then there is another element, which is users. And I think that users of Bitcoin are basically people that use Bitcoin to pay and to receive and to save. There is also a misconception that users are only people that are paying. Actually, in a way, receiving is more important than paying, in the sense that the guy that decides if this is a valid payment or not is the receiver, not the payer. So that's really what defines what Bitcoin is. And since Bitcoin is also a tool for saving, you could not receive any Bitcoin for years and not spend any Bitcoin for years, and you will be a user, because you're using Bitcoin as a tool to save your money, or to your wealth, or your value, to store your value. So you are a user every second of your life. So how often do you use Bitcoin? Always, every second. So there are users, and then there are providers of services. Providers of services are people that are basically giving to you, Bitcoin users, tools, platforms, best practices, information on how to use Bitcoin. So this broad category of providers includes a lot of stuff. The most famous are the miners, because the miners were basically overlapping with the users at the beginning of Bitcoin. So most people imagine that the miners are the ultimate provider, the most important, but that's not true. Right now, mining is very commodified, and miners are not really a very strong or consistent actor in Bitcoin governance. Unlike the block size wars, where the mining equipment producers were very strong in influencing the developing of Bitcoin, right now they basically don't even enter the debate anymore. So miners also, they are not like a unified class. There are many people inside the miner class. There are the ASIC producers, so the people producing the actual chip that will do the mining, and those are like a very centralized, represent a very centralized industry. Then there are the people that are the hashers, the grinders, the ones that actually are taking these chips and providing electricity and cooling, and they are actually making it work. And then there are the pools, which are the coordinators that will basically aggregate a lot of grinders in order to reduce variance. And these are three different actors. Pools are very centralized, but they are not very powerful. It's very easy to switch from a pool to the other if they try to attack. And also with Stratum V2, they will get even less power. Grinders, hashers, the actual runners of the mining process, they are not centralized as well, because it's very inconvenient to put all the miners under all the ASICs under the same roof in the same system. They are very spread out. They seek for cheap energy all around the world. ASIC producers are more centralized. But miners, which is this category, they are not the only kind of providers. Right now with Lightning getting strong, with Lightning becoming a real layer of payment on top of the Bitcoin layer 1, you also have Lightning Service Providers, or LSP. If you are a Lightning user, it's very hard to do liquidity management yourself, to do atomic swap in, submarine swap out, to do routing even. Right now you do routing on your node, but eventually you will have to delegate routing to trampoline nodes. So there are many things that are specializing. This is not bad necessarily. This does hurt decentralization a bit. When you have specialization, you have centralization, because the number of specialists will be reduced, so it will be easier to hit them or to corrupt them. But the important thing is that the system can re-decentralize when it's hit. So big Lightning node that do a lot of routing, a lot of swapping, there can be few and very centralized, but if you stop them, nobody will lose money and the system will just flow back away to a more decentralized configuration. A little bit like mining in China. You have very strong farms, but when the government start to ban Bitcoin mining, you basically re-decentralize to small, hidden black market farms. So you have miners, you have LSP providers, and then you have the developers that are not the governors of Bitcoin. They are just service providers. The user, which is the real governor, is together with the status quo, because the users cannot really easily change the status quo. They are a slave of the status quo, but they are the one who decide to hire basically a developer. They say, I will run your software or not. Developers are they are specialists and they can create a software that does something different, but you can choose if you run it or not. So they don't have a real say. And if you don't like those developers, it's not trivial, but you can actually create new developers by funding coding schools, by hiring people, by hiring mercenary developers. It's not as easy as saying it, because there are few competent developers, but more and more every year. And Bitcoin is becoming so complex that you will have more specialists in single branches. So the global Bitcoin core developer is a figure that will eventually go to disappear. There is no internet developer right now. There are specialists doing different parts. So I think that there is the easy government scheme with 3 points, but that's mostly broken if you use it as a model to predict Bitcoin. And then there is a more complex scheme where the important thing are status quo, users, and service providers. And service providers includes all the other stuff.